Hello, everybody. Welcome to Free Kiwis. We are here with our now semi-regular free speech correspondent or correspondent from the Free Speech Union. This is Steph Martin. So welcome back to the podcast, Steph.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
The
And also
fourth
adjunct.
Oh,
adjunct fellow for the New Zealand Initiative as well,
that's right. So you're not really a correspondent. You're just sort of one of us, but you're
and
also working for the Free Speech.
and kind of honorary Free Kiwis host by now. This must be the fourth Free Kiwis trialogue,
Yeah, it's the fourth trilogue.
Excellent.
and we're here to talk about institutional neutrality at universities, amongst possibly other things,
And I think also academic freedom.
academic freedom more
academic freedom
generally.
legislation. Yeah.
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 So in particular,
And
we've
maybe
had
how politicians engage in those things.
and how politicians engage with these important debates. So I guess we got two things. The first is that you had the Free Speech Union organized several events, one in Auckland, one in Wellington, and one in Christchurch, to discuss institutional neutrality in particular, but also the new draft academic freedom legislation, which is part of the Education Training Amendment Bill number 2. That's one thing, and the other thing is that bill that I just mentioned has had its second reading, I believe, in Parliament, and there's been some debate. And we've seen some video of a couple of Labour MPs responding to this bill. And we also have a transcript of that. And I think we're agreed that it's not particularly edifying. So that's the second thing we'll talk
It
about.
was
So,
pretty ignorant, I would say.
yeah, I would agree.
Yes.
Okay,
Deeply out
before,
of touch. Mm.
what did you say?
Deeply out of touch.
Deeply out of touch. Okay, we'll come back to that. We'll justify why we've said these harsh things about these Labour politicians in a few minutes. But first, Steph, maybe since you work for the Free Speech Union as well as the New Zealand Initiative, could you just give us a summary of what these events were about and what happened?
Sure. The Education and Training Act Amendment Bill, as you just mentioned, has just had its second reading in Parliament last week. And so the idea really was to bring people together to have an open dialogue and a conversation really about one of the dimensions of that bill that we think is really important and is just an important dimension of academic freedom at large, which is institutional neutrality. That's one of the parts of the bill that there's been some controversy around, and we just thought it would be a really useful thing to bring together university academics and members of the public to kind of talk and unpack the ideas around institutional neutrality in some greater detail, to try and clarify some ideas and just share some thinking about what it really constitutes and how it might best be envisaged and enacted on university campuses. So we had three events, as you say, last week in Auckland, Christchurch, and Wellington.
Right. So you were actually
I
at
was at the
the
one at Auckland, yeah,
right.
and then obviously
We
the
were
two
at the one in
were
Wellington
kind
because we
enough
were
to be
speaking.
on the Wellington panel.
And none of us were in at the one in Christchurch, but there they had Professor Natasha Hamilton Hart
Yep.
and
Jack Heineman,
Jack
the
Heineman.
Canterbury biology professor, who has been, I guess, a sort of critic of our position on institutional neutrality. I think he thinks that institutional neutrality is a kind of false god and that it actually interferes with universities' own freedom of speech.
So we should come back to that issue because
Yeah.
it does lie at the heart of some of the debates about this legislation. But first of all, Steph, can you tell us what happened at the Auckland one? How was that?
Sure. So the two panelists that we had sort of as part of the discussion in Auckland were Judge David Harvey and Sir Peter Hunter. They were fantastic, and I thought it was a really fantastic discussion. So initially, Sir Peter Hunter sort of framed the conversation with a bit of a presentation around institutional neutrality, its history, sort of grounding it in historic examples, and sort of opening the discussion and talking a little bit around current sorts of debates around it. And then that sort of opened up into the panel, and then that opened up to the wider audience. And we ended up with a really remarkable situation where we were in quite a large lecture theatre actually, and we had a decent sized audience, and really the audience really started to get engaged in the conversation. And so we had this not even backwards and forwards, it was sort of everyone was getting involved in the conversation from all corners of the room. And so we had academics and members of the public, and the panelists were together kind of unpacking some of these ideas. And there did end up being some ideas that were somewhat contentious, I would say, with back and forth within the audience. So it was actually a
Right.
really robust discussion. And I remember leaving and thinking this was really the kind of conversation that should be happening at the moment. actually unpacking ideas and having the controversial positions, I guess, stated forthrightly.
Certainly. It'd be good to
Yeah.
know about some of those ideas. So perhaps could you summarize the way in which Sir Peter framed the concept of institutional neutrality? Because there isn't necessarily agreement about what that means.
No, well, I think he really grounded it in what I think the three of us would agree that it represents, which is just the institution not being able to take positions or at least enunciate decisions. This is something that we've started to kind of think through a little bit more recently, right? And you talked about in your podcast last week about this, not announcing positions that the university takes on particular issues, whether contentious or not, the effect that that can have on staff within a university and the way that it can stifle sort of debate.
Right. So the classic example of that in my mind is the listener letter, right? And the reaction of John Freshwater, the Vice Chancellor of Auckland University, who came out right after that and said, yes, we respect their right to free speech. However, the University of Auckland takes this position on Mataranga Maori. And I think that, you might say, well, those professors still had the freedom to answer back to that criticism, but you have to bear in mind that that was the boss of this huge institution that employed all of those people. So you'd expect them to be a little bit intimidated. And I think most run-of-the-mill academics who are not professors, as all the listener letter authors were, would feel even more intimidated at the university itself through the vice chancellor taking an institutional position. And that's really the key idea behind the idea that institutional neutrality is actually a key part of academic freedom.
Because academic freedom belongs to the academics rather than the university as an institution, at least when it comes to being a critic and conscience of society.
Yes.
And by that, you're actually referring to the language of the Education Training Act, right? You're saying that's how it's defined.
That's how it's defined. And while some aspects of academic freedom, such as deciding on what should be in courses, belongs to the university as an institution, the critic and conscience part it's very clearly doesn't. It belongs only to staff and students. So that I think makes it really clear that institutions should not, as you put it, Steph, enunciate public positions in order to safeguard the debate that should take place between individual members of the university.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So it's really just picking up on that point about the listener letter. A really interesting aspect of the evening was that somebody from the audience actually asked Sir Peter Hunter the question of whether he thought that if the listener letter happened again now, whether it would be a better outcome, like whether we'd see, I guess, a response from the university that would be more in line with the kind of academic freedom that they really should have shown in the first place. And we had two authors of the listener letter in the audience with us. So that ended up being quite an interesting conversation. And in general, people seem to feel that there would be a better, and Sir Peter said this as well, that he thought that there would be a better result now.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting that to reflect that probably the way things have gone in part because of that whole furor over that letter. And so it's a chicken and egg situation in a way. That the way it's played out is that as a result of that letter, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say a community has galvanized behind the people who wrote it, and they've become part of a much wider movement to reform universities. So we might reflect on that situation. Certainly it was very difficult for the authors at the time. But maybe, it was a sacrifice worth making to get all of this on the agenda.
Yes. I do think it's important as well, and this wasn't discussed so much at the event, but to understand that some of those ramifications are actually still being felt by the authors. Like I've been quite stunned at some of still the responses that are being seen to the letter now, even 4 years later. So I don't think that's sort of just a relic of the past. I think it actually flows through into things still now, but it is, I think there's a signal of hope there that there might be a better response to such a situation now.
And to be perfectly clear, it was all a terribly unjust thing for them. The fallout for Professor Kendall Clements is ongoing, as you say, and he doesn't deserve that. Professor Elizabeth Rata, I mean, it seems to be water off a duck's back to her, and she's been putting up with this stuff for years and years. But of course, then there's the two fellows of the Royal Society, in fact, three originally, who were investigated by the Royal Society with a view to expelling them. Michael Corbelis died before that situation was resolved. Robert Nola is dead now too. Eventually they dropped the proceeding under pressure from Gavin Martin and others, but gee, it was awful for them, and as you say, for some of them it remains awful. So we don't want to downplay that at all. But I think we can say that they started something important.
Can I actually come in here, because it just occurs to me that we might do a little diversion for 4 minutes and 37 seconds if we want to, which is just talk a little bit more about the listener letter episode and how that intersects with questions of institutional neutrality. Because when I wrote up that section of the report which deals with the listener letter, I'd actually forgotten, or maybe I hadn't even known in the first place, how many institutions actually came out within 1 or 2 days, sometimes maybe up to a week, but very quickly after the listener letter was published. They came out, all these institutions, and they denounced the listener letter authors. And it wasn't just the University of Auckland, it was the Royal Society. Famously, as Michael just said, they initiated an investigation into some of the authors, but it was also the New Zealand Association of Scientists, the New Zealand Association of Psychologists, the Tertiary Education Union sent them a letter. So I guess my question is just, this might be interesting to think about, should all of those institutions have been institutionally neutral, or just some of them, in your view? Both of you.
Well, the union is supposed to represent its members. I don't know how many of the listener letter authors were members of the TEU. Some of them probably were, but the letter that was sent to them was certainly anything but supportive. I don't suppose the union has a duty to be neutral on matters.
You would think though, yeah, we're sort of wading into areas where I'm aware of my own kind of incomplete understanding. I know that some of them were members of the TEU. I couldn't say how many of them. But I know that those who were members of the union got absolutely zero support from them.
Well,
yeah, I should be.
They got denounced by the union.
I should be a little bit careful saying that they got denounced by the union, because I think what happened is that an academic who is working for the union, who was working for the union, wrote them a letter, and in that letter, he passed on comments that he'd had from other union members. He said, "Members of the union have described your letter as racist," and other words like that. So I don't know if he said in the name of the TEU, "I denounce you," or anything of that nature.
I don't think he did it in the name of the TEU, although it was on TEU letterhead, so it's a pretty fine line. As for the Royal Society, they're not a university, so but they are a quasi-academic organisation, and really ought to be.
They're getting taxpayer money to do science and scholarship, right, or to defend science and scholarship. So I always go back to, like, what do the people who are paying for these institutions expect of them? Yeah. People who pay their taxes into these institutions probably don't want like a detailed report of all the studies that have been published by these places or been supported by these places, but they do probably want a sense that they're actually doing what their charter says they should be doing, that they're defending science, they're defending scholarship, and they're doing so in a politically disinterested way. Yes. And so the question is, is what the Royal Society did consistent with that?
And it fairly obviously wasn't, to the extent that distinguished Professor Gavin Martin, and I think some 40 or 60 other fellows of the society took the executive to task over it, and eventually got the investigation called off. So at least you could say that the internal workings of the Royal Society did its job, even though it was an unpleasant and unnecessary process to get there.
Do we know what exactly it was that the Royal Society were, like, what their claim was, if you will?
They claim, so they said in defense of their position, that they had complaints from individual members, and I can't remember exactly what the complaints were, but I think they were something along the lines of, unsafe environment. The letter made the environment in the Royal Society unsafe for them. And also, I should add in their defense that they said that they have a process whereby if anybody tenders a complaint, they have to initiate a process automatically, and the first meeting is about whether they should go forward. And they say that they did that first meeting and then they decided not to go forward. And so they didn't really investigate very far.
Mm.
I know that Robert Nola, in something he wrote about the issue, felt that they shouldn't even have had that first meeting. There was no need. That the complaints obviously didn't merit any further attention.
Yeah, yeah. I would have some sympathy if there was like an internal system that dictated that they had to address to some extent complaints that were made, but again,
Yeah, I'm not sure how I feel about that because, for example, I mean, I got this, as you both know, I got this complaint when I was at Victoria University because the textbook used the word retarded. And I was made to go through several meetings about that where I felt like the correct response would have just been to sort of write back to the student and say, this is kind of
This is a vexatious
and
complaint.
explain why.
Yes.
Normally,
Yes,
those
sorry,
sorts of
that's kind of what I was suggesting would be an appropriate response to that. It's more just that it needs to be addressed in some capacity, but writing back to that student would have been some capacity.
I see. Yeah,
no,
yeah.
Normally these kinds of compulsory processes have a clause that says if the complaint is vexatious or frivolous, then it can be dismissed out of hand, and that's
Right.
probably what should have happened both in the
Yes.
ancient history textbook case and in the Royal Society case.
Okay, but let me just I know this is more than 4 minutes and 37 seconds, but it's interesting. Let me just play devil's advocate for a minute. So let's go back to the New Zealand Association of Scientists, who also denounced the listener letter authors. So they're an association of scientists. It's sort of like a members organization. And what if, the majority of scientists in that group thought that what the listener letter authors had written was bad and wrong, and they just wanted to express that view? What's wrong with that? And to require them to be institutionally neutral on that issue would be to curtail their academic freedom rights, wouldn't it?
That sounds like the same argument being made by the Labor Party member who said that it's an encroachment on the academic freedom of the university to require them to be institutionally neutral. The individual members of the Association of Scientists should be free to say whatever they like and then be criticised for it potentially or disagreed with. But the organisation itself, if it takes a position, it has a similar intimidatory effect as a university taking a position, I would have thought. If it's supposed to promote academic and scientific debate, which you'd think an association of scientists should do.
Do you think associations like that can ever make statements on public issues? Because you might think that one of the reasons they're formed is so that they can actually contribute to debate. I mean, this is what a lot of people are saying about the idea of institutional neutrality at the university. Is like, no, we're experts. We want to actually be able to have a say on things. Want to be able to come out in public with some sort of weight. And with the university, I actually think it's extremely dangerous for lots of reasons. But one of the big ones for me is that universities are taxpayer-funded public institutions, and I'm just wondering about things like the New Zealand Association of Scientists.
I don't think they have any. They probably don't have any legal. They don't have any legal duty, but I would have thought that if they want to have a culture of robust scientific debate, then taking institutional positions is a bad idea.
Right.
I would have thought it's sort of contrary to the whole, scientific endeavor itself, actually. And unless you could sort of take into account the scientific understanding that when you come to a conclusion, it's sort of the best explanation at that time, but it's always subject to.
Yeah.
I mean, scientists have heated arguments all the time, and that's not a bad thing. But again, if there's a kind of club of scientists like this who decide to take a collective position and beat up on some dissenters, then
I'd have to reread the letter that they sent. I think and to determine whether it's accurate to say that they beat up on them, and I think that it was a little bit moralistic, as I recall. So I would probably be comfortable with like an association of scientists writing a letter about a letter that they disagreed with, saying, we as your colleagues saw your letter and we just want to make the following points. And they could be empirical points or, logical points about statistical methodology.
Right.
I think that would be fine as long as the tone was collegial. And I think that what we really don't want, that we see all the time in academia nowadays, are these sort of moralistic attacks of you're being a bad person by putting forward these views.
And they should have some, if they're going to have a collective position, some democratic way of coming to that position. I don't know if they did.
That's very important, and maybe we'll come back to that point when it comes to the universities. But anyway, that was my diversion, which was meant to last only 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Let's go back to the Auckland event. Peter Hunter is still talking, or we're going to move? Was there another speaker you wanted to summarize?
Justice Harvey?
No, I just wanted to bring that question really from from the audience participation sort of segment, it was just relevant to what you were raising there.
Okay, well, I will say though that in what you said, it emerges that there were a good number of academics from the University of Auckland and maybe other universities in Auckland, AUT, for example, I don't know. But anyway, there were a good number of academics there, and they were taking part in the discussion, and that's really, really nice. I mean, that's actually not something that happened at the Wellington version, even though I kind of understand because it was a Saturday night, but that sounds really positive.
Yeah, I was very encouraged. Um, Not so much by any particular thing that, well, I mean, there were great things that got said, but the thing that was encouraging to me was the fact that the dialogue happened and the way that the dialogue took place and the fact that people were expressing different points of view and yet everyone was still, collegial at the end of it,
Right.
I thought it was exactly the kind of conversation that really needs to be happening. And so I thought there was great value in it.
Excellent. So do you want to ask us about R1?
Well,
Steph?
tell me about it. Yeah.
Oh, okay, that's easy. All right, so let's see if I can remember. I was speaking at the time, so I should remember. I mean, one feature I think was interesting about ours is that we tried to have a debate. We wanted to have a debate or a panel with like two speakers on one side and two on the others. We actually did I invited Sandra Gray. I think you invited Nicole Morum from
Nicole
the law
Morum
school.
and Richard Arnold and also the chap whose name I always forget,
Max
Rashbrook. They all politely declined because they had other engagements. They all said that they would otherwise have engaged. So,
which is also a good sign.
The willingness was certainly there. Yeah.
So anyway, so we didn't really have. Well, we were afraid we wouldn't have much of a debate because we're sort of on the same side on this issue. But we kind of did have a debate in the end because Jonathan, the fearless leader of the Free Speech Union, actually has a different view to us on this, and I think he was actually a little bit persuaded by what Jack Heinemann had said at the Christchurch edition. And he was actually pushing reasonably strongly this idea that institutional neutrality can violate the free speech rights or the academic freedom rights of institutions.
Was he arguing that? I thought it was more that when you say that a university shouldn't take a position on a matter of public interest or a substantive matter, that you're basically precluding them from operating because they have to take implicit positions through various of their policies.
I think he did say that, but I think he was saying what I was saying too, because then I had to counterattack and say that, remember, we had that conversation about whether Jonathan would agree with institutional neutrality even on sort of public servants or ministries and courts and things like that. And he was inclined to say, yes, there should be some institutional neutrality. And then I sort of pounced and said, haha, then you are against the free speech rights of those people, leader of the Free Speech Union. So
in any event, what I found really helpful about that conversation was that it did allow us to tease out kind of implicit positions that universities take by implementing various policies. And as you put it before, Steph, articulating those positions publicly. And I think that we came to the view, James and I, that the legislation, rather than saying that universities should not take positions, should say they should not issue public statements on matters.
Right, because what happens when you say, as it currently says in the legislation, the draft legislation, universities should not take positions, is that they come out with statements like the ETAB2 statement on institutional neutrality, where they say, well, of course we have to take positions on things like sustainability. If we put up a building, we have to have some position on whether it's going to be environmentally friendly. And when we hire people, we have to take up some implicit position on our view on equity. And therefore, they can put in their institutional neutrality statement, we're going to be institutionally neutral, except when it comes to sustainability, equity, and a whole bunch of other things. And then later on, I suspect they're going to start saying, well, look, we have a carve out here for sustainability and equity and other things. So now we're going to put out a statement on behalf of the University of Otago saying that we should endorse net zero, or we should say that our official position is that climate change as it's currently being observed is 100% anthropogenic.
Or the treaty is a partnership or whatever it is.
That's right.
So by saying that they shouldn't issue public statements, it rules out doing that while still enabling them to enact whatever policies they feel they need to, whether that's based on interpretation of legislation, things that they're obligated to do, or things that they choose to do, because they should be able to choose to build sustainable buildings and so on.
And we also recently had a statement out of another university on institutional neutrality, and this was Harvard University. And they did their job very well, I think. They were probably influenced by people like Steven Pinker, who's been thinking really hard about these issues for many years. And their wording is very similar to the wording that's currently in the New Zealand bill. But instead of take positions, it says universities should not issue official statements.
Right.
So I think we should probably adopt some language like that. I think the only problem with that language, the only reason someone might complain about that language is that it then makes it harder for people like us to complain about Auckland's or courses like Auckland's compulsory Waipapa Taumata Rao course, right? Because one of my complaints about that course is that it does seem to take an implicit or really even an explicit position on behalf of the university because it's compulsory and because it bears the name, the Maori name of the university. I think that course is basically saying this is the University of Auckland's position. But it would be difficult, I think, or more difficult to describe it as, what is it? Issuing an official statement.
I agree with you. I'm not sure. I mean, I think I've come to the position that the institutional neutrality clause in the Education and Training Amendment Act is not the right mechanism to deal with that problem. And in fact, it's a pretty hard problem to deal with because it's ultimately the university is captured by a certain ideology that it's determined to implement in some of its courses. And perhaps, this is a pretty unsatisfactory solution, but it's probably a solution in the long run. They'll probably lose money when international students decide they don't want to pay however many $1,000 it is they have to pay to do this compulsory course and go to an Australian university instead, or even domestic students decide they'd rather not enroll at Otago or Victoria or somewhere else.
Yeah, there was a lot of frustration in the room at our event about that course in particular and why we couldn't do something about it, and about other courses that people thought were kind of ridiculous. I mean, I brought up the example of the course at the University of Waikato on white settler colonialism. And I actually defended that on academic freedom grounds because I think, the Education and Training Act says very clearly that academics have the right to design their own courses.
Of course, that isn't a compulsory course, which makes it a bit different.
That for me was the crucial difference.
Is it, this is something that I've been wondering about and have been meaning to clarify. Maybe we can just tease this out a little bit here. Is it the academics themselves who have the, in terms of being able to create their own course content, and who has the control over that by legislation? Is that the academics themselves, or is that the universities?
Well, it's both. So there's quite a process for implementing a course or a program. Normally the way it works is that the individual faculties, schools and programs will design various courses that fit together to form majors and degree programs. And then they'll structure those so that it's likely that at 100 level, at first year level, there will be a compulsory course because everybody needs the grounding in this knowledge to advance in the discipline. But the way that courses are approved is that normally the course has to be approved by QAP, which is an arm of Universities New Zealand, and it will go through an internal process, an academic committee who will then send it back to the department or school with various amendments suggested, and eventually it will go through QAP and then become approved. So there is an approval process that is not just an academic can teach whatever course they want.
Which is kind of interesting, actually, because, I mean, I took Steph's question to be about what it says in the Education and Training Act.
It doesn't say any of that in the
Exactly,
Education
and
and
I
Training.
think actually in the Education and Training Act, my recollection is that it says the universities have that power. So yeah. I wonder, like, is QAP in violation of the Education and Training Act?
Well, I mean, technically, the Universities New Zealand probably has been given some kind of jurisdiction over what gets approved. And of course, universities will insist on things like course minima and cut courses that are not attracting enough students.
Like Latin and Greek?
So like Latin and Greek, a very, very good case in point, because everybody, as far as I know, in the classics program at Victoria University wanted to keep Latin and Greek, and yet they were overridden by the university as a whole that said, we're not making money out of these, which is probably pretty short-sighted, since those are, like ancient Greek and Latin, are foundational for a lot of classical studies knowledge, and therefore you might not see all of the money that you recoup through teaching those courses in the course fees for those courses themselves, but rather people you retain as postgraduates and so on. But anyway, that's the decision they made, certainly overriding the views of the academics concerned. So
it's just interesting to me that we have all these academics who are sort of fiercely denouncing this bill because they think it interferes with the autonomy of universities to design their own curricula. But where were these people when? How long has QApp been around? I mean, why aren't they complaining about QApp interfering with university autonomy?
indeed.
Well, so this is what I've just been kind of mulling over, right? Is to what extent are the courses like the Waipapa Taumataro course, to what extent is that, the staff who have created the course have the ability to do that under their kind of academic freedom provisions to be able to set their own course content versus what can the university do and how do those things interact? It's an interesting question. And
Yeah, I mean, there are two possible
ponder it.
objections to that course. One is that it's compulsory. As Jonathan pointed out, though, there are a lot of compulsory courses. Normally, they have something to do with the subject or degree that a student has decided to study. It's not at all clear that this course has anything to do with, say, science or architecture or whatever else. So even so, it's probably hard to argue that because it's compulsory, it shouldn't exist. The other objection is that it's imposed, as James said, by the university itself rather than coming from any particular school or faculty. And that's very unusual. There's no rule against it that I'm aware of, but to have a compulsory course that is fairly obviously ideologically motivated being imposed by the universities on every degree program against the will of the university council. Was it the university council that knocked it back?
The
I think it was
Senate.
the
The
Senate.
Senate.
Yeah.
Sorry, the Senate knocked it back. So it's a very bad look, but whether they've violated any rules is probably pretty
For me,
hard to.
just to repeat a point I made earlier, but I think it's also important that it has this sort of symbolic effect because of the name. Like it's literally called the University of Auckland. It's not literally called the University of Auckland. It's literally called, what is it? Waipapa Taumata. But that is the Maori name of the University of Auckland. So you have a course called the University of Auckland,
That
right? Which
is,
is kind of a weird name for a
compulsory
course.
by that university. Yep.
Because you might think like I'm signing up for the University of Auckland, but anyway, I like course titles to actually describe like what the course is and what's in the course. But anyway, that aside, it also sort of suggests very strongly to me that the university endorses everything that's in that course, right? In a way that Waikato, I don't know if the vice chancellor would endorse the course on white settler colonialism, but at least they have that excuse that they can say that's just one academic doing their thing. We're the vice chancellor. We're not here to sort of endorse every single course. We're just here to sort of help the university function.
I mean, it is true as well. Now I think about it, that degree programs are regularly reviewed, and the panels that run those reviews are from a variety of universities, not all of them New Zealand universities. I think in particular of a time when they reviewed the Master of Education at Victoria, and that panel included somebody from Australia. It also included various academics from around the country, not necessarily in education. And I, at the time, was teaching a research methods paper on that program, and in particular a statistics component. And I was told by an academic who was not an educationalist, knew nothing much about statistics, that I needed to include a Mataranga Māori perspective in the way I taught statistics. I pushed back on that fairly hard, and nothing changed. But that's an interesting kind of question about whose academic freedom was being challenged by that.
Right. Let's just say a couple more things about our event then, and maybe then we should move on because we want to talk about these Labour politicians, what they said in Parliament. But do you have any last sort of reflections on that event and how it went?
Well, it was a great discussion. I definitely think it helped me advance my thinking and refine my thinking about how to make some suggestions regarding the legislation when we write our submission. In particular, about distinguishing the holding of an implicit position through policy from making public statements. And there's always going to be a grey area there which we can hash out.
Yeah, for me, I think what was most interesting in some ways, I mean, the arguments themselves that we had with Jonathan, I think it was a good discussion in the end. And at moments, it was quite a good debate and quite a sharp debate. But besides that, I think what I enjoyed most was the sort of demotic or populist atmosphere. I've been to two events now in the Legislative Chamber building in Parliament in Wellington. And even though Wellington has this reputation of being the home of the Pōneketanga, this sort of intellectual elite, mostly progressive, I find that in these Wellington events, we get a lot of people who aren't from the universities. And actually, they say that. I think at the James Lindsay event, several people stood up and said, well, I don't have a degree. I'm not an intellectual. This event, somebody said that as
They
well,
did.
right?
Yeah.
And I was quite struck by that. And the sense,
proceeded to ask a very erudite question.
exactly, and very intelligent people in most cases. And the sense I got from the audience was very interesting because it's kind of what I've been trying to tell my former university colleagues for years and years, that there's a groundswell of public opinion against the universities, that university academics could easily have calmed down by just being reasonable, and by going out and saying we are taking our responsibilities to taxpayers seriously. Of course, we're going to defend our academic freedom and research what we want and teach what we want, but we're not in this for partisan reasons. We're not just going to sort of double down on ideological courses, and we're not going to sort of shame people who think differently. We're not going to ostracize people who think differently. They didn't do any of that, right? When I joined Heterodox Academy and you joined Heterodox Academy a few years ago, and we started making these arguments, instead they just sort of got worse, and they engaged in more social ostracism and more kind of getting rid of people from their jobs for their political opinions. And at this point, I could hear from that audience just these groans, every time we mentioned courses like the White Settler one or the compulsory one at Auckland. People just hate this stuff, and it's only a matter of time, perhaps it's already happening, before they don't support universities.
They
and
lose their social license.
And we've seen this in the States. I said this in the meeting, right? That there's a good survey evidence from the States that you ask people, do you support universities? Do you think that they're a force for good in your society? And it used to be the case that both Democrats and Republicans, a majority of them said yes. And then, Republicans started to say no. And now both Democrats and Republicans think that universities in the United States are a negative force on society. So we may actually be getting to that point in New Zealand. Of that audience last week is good evidence for that.
And of course, that could have two effects deleterious to the university. One is that people become less willing to pay taxes to support them, and the other is that they become less encouraging of their children to attend them.
That's right. And we also had a conversation. I think someone actually explicitly asked, what can we do to, well, I think he asked, are the universities going to survive? But I think implicit in his question was something like, what can we do to further the demise of universities?
Yeah.
And then we had a conversation about, whether we could have more competition from online providers, et cetera. But that's where a lot of people are at. And people at universities may say, well, they're not the important people, but these are your support base. These are the taxpayers that are actually funding your institutions.
And the parents of the children who go there as young adults.
And they're citizens, right? You've got to respect people's views. That's the way I was brought up anyway. Okay. Speaking of which, let's talk about the views, which, we respect their ability to speak them in Parliament, but these views that I think we can say already we disagree with. So let's just start. What was
we should let Steph off her leash on this one. I think she's got a few things to say about what those members.
Okay, how will Steph? We'll unleash you. Just tell us first, like, who these people are and what they said, and then you can sink your teeth into them.
Sure. So this was last Wednesday, I believe, in the afternoon, was the second reading of the Education and Training Amendment Bill, number 2. And there was, as is kind of customary, there was a parliamentary debate on the second reading of it. And the comments of two of the members of the Labour Party, so Phil Twyford and Shannon Halbert, were just particularly concerning, I would say. I was quite surprised and struck by what they said, because it really seemed to, well, I mean, there's a number of issues really, but I was surprised that it seemed that there was a real lack of awareness on their part of what the experience has actually been.
So what did Shannon Halbert have to say, first of all?
Community. Well, both of them kind of took very similar lines, and essentially the sense of what they were saying was that, and maybe this picks up on what we were just talking about, that this legislation isn't something that Kiwis actually care about. It's not something that's important. It's something that is sort of the implication is that it's a waste of time for Parliament to be talking about
Mm.
because there are greater concerns out there in society at the moment.
They certainly said that. I also heard Shannon Halbert say that universities hadn't called for it, which seemed like
Yes.
a strange thing to expect, that the institution that's been not doing its job for taxpayers being expected to is something that it would call for.
Well, not
Yes.
only that, I mean, you can even make a sharper point there, I think, which is that the managers, the head of the universities, who would be the ones sort of appealing to the politicians, and apparently they aren't, they're the people who have actually been the bullies, right? If you look at my
Yes.
report published last year, I have several episodes where it is actually the senior administrative staff, including vice chancellors like Jan Thomas at Massey, who deplatform people. I mean, another example is Derek McCormack at AUT, who was responsible for canceling an event that an ethnic Chinese lecturer at his university had organized to commemorate the Tiananmen Square massacre. At the same time as he got a request from the Chinese embassy, because the Chinese embassy, i.e., the Chinese Communist Party, was concerned about this event. And I think he also, Derek McCormack, the then vice chancellor of AUT, was responsible for deplatforming Daphne Whitmore, gender critical feminist. So it's just really weird, that I've and others have documented that it's the managers who are actually doing a lot of this bullying and who are the reason for the problem in large part. And then we're going to bring in legislation to sort of stop that bullying. And then these politicians are standing up and saying, well, the senior management hasn't asked for anything to be done. So it's kind of like, we have evidence that there's lots of theft going on in Wellington. And then and we bring in a law to deal with it. And the politicians say, well, the thieves haven't asked for anything to be done against thieves.
It's actually even more like the mafia bosses asking for a special task force to take down the mafia.
Yeah, it's just, yeah, I completely agree. I mean, to be honest, there are just so many layers to the problem and what they've said, and I completely agree. I mean, some of the lines from what they said include, tell me a university or a tertiary institution in this country that says this is a priority. That was something that Shannon Halbert said. Also by him, universities are independent institutions that can absolutely manage themselves. And Phil Twyford was casting this as a bill that is full of ministerial overreach and micromanagement. So implying that the government is like reaching into the university's business where it isn't wanted.
Right.
And along similar lines, Shannon Halbert, universities don't agree with this legislation. And Phil Twyford, universities need to be given the academic freedom to make those decisions. And
There's so many things there, Steph.
There
So
are.
many good things there. There's so many things I want to pick up
so
on as
many
well.
things there.
So,
But
but
let's
maybe
start off. I just want to start like
You
this.
go.
Absolutely, the universities can absolutely manage themselves. Okay, we've shown, we know that they haven't. I mean, all the details are in my report. As I could repeat those examples and add other ones, but you can look it up in my report. I mean, there's so many examples of universities failing to uphold their own legal obligations. There are already existing legal obligations under the Education and Training Act. So they've proven they can't manage themselves. And also, even when we've given them a chance, they could see that there was going to be a public backlash against this and a legal backlash, or at least politicians would be formulating law against this. And they had a chance in the last couple of years to actually put out reasonable and good faith free speech and academic freedom statements and institutional neutrality statements. And what we've seen, and we've actually covered this extensively on the show with you, Steph, we've done a lot of good work looking at going through these academic freedom statements and showing that they're just incredibly ideological and like extreme. They have all this extreme progressive ideology.
with the
and then,
exception of the Otago one, perhaps.
but maybe with the exception of the Otago academic freedom one, but I mean the Otago institutional
That's a
neutrality
different
one.
story, yeah.
I think Jonathan Ailing thinks more highly of it, but I just think that to me that's a blatant statement of we will honor institutional neutrality except for this and
Except
this
for our
and this
sacred
and this other thing,
causes.
this other
Yeah.
thing, and this other thing. All the
Yeah.
things actually that people are worried about, like the Treaty of Waitangi, that we know from survey evidence is the number one issue that academics and students feel they can't talk about. So just to summarize, I think academics have comprehensively shown they've gone out of their way to demonstrate that they cannot manage themselves, and that's why we're intervening.
The next thing I think that's surfaced is the purported tension between institutional neutrality and institutional autonomy. What are your thoughts about that, Steph?
Yes, well, I think if I might say something that was on my mind, and hopefully it'll weave back into answering that
Sure.
question. But, just I think one of the real issues for me in what they're saying is that, I mean, to say universities don't agree with this legislation, what do you mean universities, right? Who in the university doesn't agree with this legislation? Like, who are you talking about? And it seems to me that entirely the current through what they were saying was reflecting only the point of view of vice chancellors, who, as you say, James, have been the bullies in this situation quite often. So I think there's a real, I mean, to me, honestly, this coming from members of the Labour Party, there is a deep, deep irony that they're only talking to the people who are at the head of these institutions, who are effectively saying, oh, there's nothing to see here.
Right.
They're siding
And
with the bosses.
yeah, and only listening to the people at like the top of the organizational pyramid. And I would have thought that members of the Labour Party would be very concerned with the experience of the people who were living this reality on the ground,
Yeah, and it's not
the
just
academics themselves.
yeah.
And instead, there seems to be a serious conflation here between the university as an institution and the individuals who comprise the university,
Well, there's
or
the
the
students as
academics,
well, right?
and the students, exactly.
And
So,
for that matter, other stakeholders like the people who employ the degree holders.
yes. And
And,
so to say that the universities don't agree, how, like on what basis? Who has he spoken to?
right. And it's not only that they haven't done any kind of survey or systematic surveys of university staff, run-of-the-mill academics and students, but like we have. I mean, we have as part of
Yes.
Heterodox New Zealand and as part of the Free Speech Union, and the TEU has also done surveys of academics and students on the topic of academic freedom. Again, it's all in my report. Sorry, I have to keep repeating that, but it is.
Well, it
And
is, it's
so we
true.
have very solid evidence now, and people can pick away at some of the limitations of individual surveys, but there's 6 surveys that we cover in the report, and not all of them have those limitations, right? And they all come to the same conclusion that there are substantial minorities of academics, in some cases like slight majorities of academics, who say they feel inhibited discussing certain issues. So
Hmm.
there's lots and lots of people at academics who are crying out for something to be done about academic freedom.
Yes, and this very much seems to sideline their point of view and to completely ignore the experience of people who are facing this on a daily basis, who are feeling suppressed, marginalized, not like they're able to um, access the rights that they're actually guaranteed to.
Or
The rights
maybe,
That
and
already
and in
exists
fact
in
the
legislation.
duty that they have if
Yes,
they're an academic to.
and we can include people who used to be at universities but are now outside of them because they've had their careers ended by bullying
Or
and
decided to walk away in
persecution for
disgust.
their political views.
Yeah. So I'd like to come back to this question of institutional autonomy.
yes.
So one of the claims that has been made, I think, by universities and was certainly implicit in Phil Twyford's comments, is that expecting universities to comply with their legislated roles is somehow violating their autonomy, which is a fairly biased way for me to describe it, but that's how it seems to me.
Yes. I mean, I find that quite a remarkable thing for him to have said, actually. I mean, see if I can just find the
I mean, the claim seems to be that their autonomy should extend to them being able to decide not to do the job that they're funded to do.
yes. So one of the statements that he made was just talking about sort of what this act will impose. He said, at first glance, looking at this bill, they're going to have to undertake a heavy bureaucratic reporting regime on freedom of speech. And it was striking to me that he would have that there would be an issue with holding universities accountable to the responsibilities and duties that they already have by legislation, to say, oh well, demonstrating that you're actually doing what you're legislatively required to do, we don't want that because it might give the universities some extra paperwork.
Yeah.
I just can't quite fathom that.
It's also like an extremely light burden, right? It's
Yes,
saying
I was going to say.
all you have to do is report. Possibly will require them to do surveys, but again, that's like an extremely light burden. It's pretty easy for them to do. They have all the resources in the world to do that kind of thing.
And if they don't want to do much reporting, then the simple way to achieve that outcome is not to violate people's academic freedom.
Exactly. To me, it sort of gives the game away because this, we're saying all you have to do is describe all the incidents where people's academic freedom has been violated over the course of the previous year. And they're all like, oh my God, that would take so much work. Right? Why would it take so much work? You have a guilty
Well, it
conscience
wouldn't
about
take much
something?
work if there weren't
I
instances
know,
of
exactly.
violations of academic freedom, right? So
it's very hard to see that requiring them to be institutionally neutral, at least as regards making public statements, and also upholding academics and students' academic freedom in any way violates their autonomy, or at least any sort of autonomy that they ought to have. The other thing that's probably worth picking up on from those politicians' claims in Parliament is Phil Twyford's point about institutions having academic freedom. And if you look at the existing Education and Training Act, it is true that they are afforded academic freedom in respect of some things, like their course content and the courses they teach. But interestingly, they're excluded from the clause that gives academics and students the role as critic and conscience of society. So the institutions are not included in that part of academic freedom. And so there is nothing in the existing legislation that affords them the right to make public statements on matters, because they're not supposed to be, as institutions, the critic and conscience, but rather the venue for others to be the critic and conscience of society.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so on this overreach idea, I mean, Shannon Halbert says, tell me where a university or tertiary institution in this country has said that they want the government meddling in their business. These are taxpayer-funded public universities. Overreaching and making a decision about who can speak at their university. So this is interesting. Like, he sort of conjures up this image that this law is going to sort of say to the universities in every single case who's going to speak at their university. But really what it does is it protects the freedom of people to invite people onto campus and then have those events go ahead without activists in cahoots with the management shutting those events down. And this is the pattern. Like, if you look at my report again, that's what usually happens, is that somebody kicks up a fuss. Maybe it's the Chinese embassy, maybe it's one or two student activists, and then the senior management of the university immediately goes along with it, right? This happened with Daphne Whitmore. It happened with
Don Brash. In fact,
with Don Brash, it wasn't even they got a complaint.
She was right on the ground floor on that one, wasn't she?
So again, Halbert later on says universities sometimes have to make the very difficult decision not to host events. He thinks it's sort of under vast pressure. All these people are protesting. There are these huge health and safety issues. Whereas actually in some of these cases, some of these cases like one or two activists and then the management goes along with it. In some of these cases, like with the Jan Thomas one, you can see in her emails, she's the one driving it and she's desperate. She keeps writing to her top brass, is there any way we can shut this down? And in that case, that was a student politics group who wanted to have Don Brash come and speak. So it was the academic freedom of those students that was violated.
Yeah. I was quite baffled actually by the sentiment that with hosting speakers, where is it? What we're finding is that some far left or far right speakers are hosted in institutions, create a number of activists and protests, hundreds of people in many instances that will turn out. And I was sort of thinking, when?
Yeah, I don't remember them being any substantial. I mean, maybe there has been somewhere sometime, but
yeah.
I think that's often used as a threat, right? It's often used as an excuse. That was the case with the Victoria University Wellington panel on academic freedom or free speech, where, we had to move it to a different space because it might harm students. And I think there was kind of the sense of, things might go down. And then, on the actual day it was absolutely fine. And it usually is in New Zealand.
Indeed. And in fact, if there was a protest, so what? I mean, you'd want it to not disrupt the event, not to intimidate people trying to enter the event. But if some people want to stand outside and with some megaphones and signs, then so be it.
That's their right. I can only think of one kerfuffle or episode of fisticuffs. It wasn't even that happened in New Zealand that I documented in my report. There's actually a video of it, and that actually is Serena Lee, I think her name was, who was a pro Hong Kong independence activist, or she wanted to defend Hong Kong's existing rights or previous existing rights against the Chinese communist state. And she kind of got into a little shoving match with some young guys who seemed to have been very nationalistic and in favor of the Communist Party of China, and she fell over. But it was a very small number of people, and actually there were similar altercations that were happening in Australian universities at the same time with lots more people. So I think just in general in New Zealand, there's very little, there are very few events when there's like hordes of screaming mobs, because we just don't have that population density and people are too polite.
Yeah, that's sort of what I was thinking. It was strange to me that it was being cast as something that's sort of a regular problem that we're having to deal with. And
yeah,
I really just was struggling to think of scenarios where that had actually played out.
Well, you might think that actually those two politicians were just being a bit political in their comments.
But you raised another important point there, Steph, that mention of like far left or far right speakers, right, that are hosted in institutions. And I think that Phil Twyford said something similar about people out there peddling disinformation and preaching hate. He has a concern about people who are preaching hate against the trans community, people who are Islamophobic, and people who are Holocaust deniers. And so he's basically saying, and he says somewhere there that, the university should not be able to just invite anyone with any view and with anything to say, right? So this is a fallacy we've seen before in this debate, where people say, well, surely you just can't have like Holocaust deniers and people who are just like shouting ethnic slurs at people on campus. And of course, nobody is arguing that, right? What we're saying is just...
I am. I think that if somebody wants to invite a Holocaust denier to a university to speak, then they should be absolutely able to speak. And at that same event, you should have real historians take them down.
Do you think that people should be able to scream ethnic slurs at members of the audience?
Oh no, I don't think that.
Okay.
I think some rules of decorum are absolutely.
Yeah, I would actually agree theoretically with the ability of Holocaust deniers to be involved in debate, because I am very confident that they would lose.
That's right.
But I guess what I'm saying is that
what better way to debunk their ideas?
Nobody's arguing that, in the sense that we've never had an actual instance. I looked through all the instances in the past decade, and I can't think of an instance where a neo-Nazi, someone invited an actual neo-Nazi onto a New Zealand university campus to defend the claim that we should kill all the Jews.
Although neo-Nazi has undergone a bit of concept creep.
That's true. People misuse the term. But
you and I are, in some people's eyes, probably neo-Nazis. So.
Sure, but I can't even think of a speaker who was invited that people would say was Islamophobic. I do know what he's talking about when he says people who are preaching hate against the trans community, but that to me is a reference to gender critical feminists.
Yeah.
And I don't think any of these people, including Daphne Whitmore, were actually preaching hate against the trans community. They were saying things like, or their view is something like, yes, we have to respect people who maybe identify with different sexes or different genders, but we also have to be able to discuss the issue, and women also want to defend their rights. And some women think that, for example, trans people shouldn't be able to go into women's changing rooms, etc. Right? They want to have a nuanced discussion.
And again, they're
not just saying we hate trans people.
Those who find those views objectionable should front up and debate them.
Right.
And if they think it's too traumatizing to do so, then I guess they don't do it, and that's on them.
But what I find very striking in these debates, especially the statements by people who oppose this type of legislation, is how they never go into detail. Right? This is a great feature of the Victoria University of Wellington panel on free speech. Everybody was saying, oh, this is all nonsense, nothing's happening. And then they would say, oh yeah, you just want people preaching hate to come on campus. And I always wanted to say, okay, let's just talk about the actual examples of where there have been flare-ups. And again, the actual examples of deplatformings at New Zealand universities have been Don Brash, former leader of the National Party, very nearly Prime Minister, former governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, was not allowed to speak. He wasn't preaching Islamophobia. He wasn't saying anything about the trans community. He was not denying the Holocaust. He had a slightly
different view. He wasn't even
view.
there to talk about the treaty.
He was going to talk about his career, but maybe some people disagreed with his view on the treaty. That's fine, but that's a very lively debate that's currently going on in New Zealand. It's nothing close to Holocaust denial. Daphne Whitmore, I've already summarized that kind of view, right? She just wants to say that some feminist women have concerns about the trans movement. Nothing to do with Holocaust denial or anything like that. Or even, we should say, misinformation. I mean, it's not clear to me that either Don Brash or Daphne Whitmore are like wildly inaccurate in the things that they say.
Misinformation is a dreadful term.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So I mean, that little paragraph of Phil Twyford just sort of revealed to me, and I think it's very revealing for eh, voters, that Phil Twyford, it seems, so keen to censor people. There's no shortage of people out there peddling disinformation and people preaching hate. My concern is that, so it seems like he actually wants to be able to deplatform people that he can label as preaching hate and disinformation. I find that very worrying from a parliamentarian, because, why wouldn't we just then say Phil Twyford's not allowed to speak in Parliament anymore because this is disinformation?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's a ridiculous position, right? It's sort of incompatible with basic sort of free speech rights and the basic ability for people in democratic societies to talk about issues.
Yeah, I mean, there are statements that are errors and there are statements that are lies, and the best way to counter both is by arguing with them.
Yeah, and you have to kind of show people, you have to try and convince people that your opponent's views are ill-founded and possibly in bad faith. You can't just declare that ex cathedra and expect people to sort of censor others on that basis.
Mm. Um, another thing that maybe just builds on that, it's a slightly different point, but I think connects. Another thing that this was Shannon Halbert actually said this, but he said, I've traveled around institutions across the Motu and universities don't agree with this legislation. We've heard that bit already.
Mm.
They don't agree with this government. They don't agree with the ACT Party. And
They have a chance to show that they don't agree in a bit more than a year if they want to kick this government out or vote against the ACT Party.
yes.
We had an exercise like that a few years ago, didn't we?
We did.
And I think it produced like the current balance of power in Parliament, and that allowed the ACT Party and the National Party to put through, or to introduce bills like this. And then we expected the opposition to be able to sort of comment on them in an informed way.
Yes. Yeah. I
They
I
blew that
found
one.
that a really problematic statement because it's sort of like drawing political lines around the debate and saying that if you're a person who's concerned about academic freedom, that is by virtue some sort of political allegiance with the ACT Party, and to not support this legislation, like it's just drawing the political lines and turning this into a political issue, which academic freedom at its heart does not take political sides, right? This is the whole point of institutional neutrality, is that it doesn't take political points. So I think trying to draw those lines around it is, yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I also think
Fine.
there's this bit in this argument where, and it happened in the exchange in Parliament as well, where people on the left say, isn't it ironic that the ACT Party and maybe even the New Zealand Initiative is recommending government intervention, because they usually hate government intervention? To which my reply is, okay, but you guys are opposing government intervention and you usually like government intervention. So that's an irony too. But I mean, more fundamentally, that's just a very superficial political point, right? It's kind of like, you guys are contradicting yourself. It's
A more
okay,
accurate way to put
there's
it.
a much more important issue at stake here, right? Which is actually, how do we secure academic freedom and free speech rights for students and staff? So let's just focus on that.
And a more accurate way to put it is that we're insisting that if taxpayers' money is spent on something, that the institutions on whom it's spent do the job that they're being paid to do.
Yeah.
With that funding.
So it's accountability.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that might just draw out, if we can, just one other point that really feels important to make, because one thing that I have taken from this that I think probably is something to be drawn out of it is helping people to see the wider relevance of why what's going on in the universities actually matters in wider society, because it does, right? And it's sort of called me to think more carefully about how we're articulating that, what role universities actually play socially. And we started to talk about these ideas, especially at the beginning already, but universities play actually very important social functions. And so what's going on here does actually matter for everyone, whether you're involved directly in university settings or not, right? Because of the role that they play in wider society. And I think these things are really important to talk about, right?
Yeah. I think we heard that very clearly at the event we were at Wellington, that there were people who were standing up and literally saying, I don't have a degree, I'm not an academic, but I'm a concerned parent or I'm a concerned taxpayer. And from what I can see, what the universities are up to is completely ridiculous. So
Yeah.
I would say again, I mean, I've tried to do this for years and years, and it just made things worse for me. But I would say again, if you're an academic at a New Zealand university, get behind the reform program, because it's actually in the long run going to help the universities actually kind of win back that social license, which is crucial to their survival.
And besides which, it's your duty.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Steph. Hey, Michael. Well, let's say I interrupted Michael. But Michael, thank you very much for being here. But mainly, Steph, thank you very much for doing here. Thank you for all the great work you're doing for the Free Speech Union.
Keep it up. I'm sure you will.
And we'll have you back on at some point. We think we'll have to discuss that. But yeah.
Thank you both.